website. Now, welcome again to PC's Prelude, setting the stage for Entwined, a double feature, our nearly sold out show on April 19th at the Terrace Theater Kennedy Center. I am honored to share the Zoom screen tonight with a group of extraordinary individuals. Tonight we have with us Derek Goldman, award-winning stage director, playwright, scholar, producer, developer. It goes on. Derek is also the artistic and executive director and co-founder of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, the Lab, at Georgetown University. With us tonight is Kevork Mourad, New York-based artist. Kevork employs his technique of live drawing and animation in concert with music and even dance, developing a collaboration in which art and music harmonize with one another. He's worked with clients all over the world, including Yo-Yo Ma, Kim Kardashian, and of course, PCE. Our moderator for tonight is the extraordinary Gail Wein, a woman of incredible talents and many talents, formerly classical music critic for the Washington Post, radio host, and producer of NPR national programs, a writer, and of course now founder of her firm, Classical Music Communications. She's also a longtime collaborator and friend of PCE. And finally tonight, we're joined by none other than the soul and heart of PCE, Ángel Gil-Ordóñez, our
Great to see you,
our music director. And now I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Gail. Gail, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it's great to see everybody, including a couple of my good friends in DC. Thank you all for joining us. And it's a real privilege to be part of this panel and speaking with you about this program, because it's really quite fascinating. I do have, I wanted to also mention that for the post-classical ensemble, I was kind of involved even before the beginning, because about 3 years before the organization formed, Ángel presented a concert with an orchestra. I broadcast the concert, I interviewed Ángel, I learned about some of the basic principles of what was important to him. And so I feel like I was in at the ground floor. So it's a real privilege to be on this end of things like 25 years later. For this program, Entwined, a double feature, which one half is a piece by Manuel de Falla, the Master Peter's puppet opera, and the other is a world premiere play by Derek Goldman. So, Ángel, you've said that this piece, Master Peter by de Falla, is one of the most significant pieces that he wrote, and it's the 100th anniversary of the performance, the first performance of it this year. Why is it significant? And if it's so great, why isn't it performed more often? And one more thing, it's a puppet opera. What's up with that? Those are my questions for you, Ángel.
Sure, Gail, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. As you can imagine, I'm always so happy to be surrounded by such extraordinary people. This is one of the wonderful things about post-classical ensemble. I think the person that learned more than anybody is myself, being surrounded by these extraordinary experts in many different things. So Gail, let me give you a little context to the to Master Peter Puppet Show, the chamber opera that will be the of which we are celebrating 100 years, written in 1923. So the first thing that we need to know is that years before, actually in 1898, Spain loses against the United States its last colonies. There is this US-American war in which Spain loses Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So the country enters some years of kind of a national depression. The empire is gone. What is happening to us? But after a few years of that depression, the reaction of intellectuals and professionals is actually the contrary. There is a reaction of renovation, how we renovate ourselves, how we include ourselves in the future of the world, of Europe especially. So there is an openness to ideas of the outside, which is an extraordinary reaction. So then our intellectuals and artists look for what is the place to be here? Where how things are happening? And of course, it was Paris. One of the first one is Picasso, who goes to Paris in 1906, and actually that year introduces the first modernist painting, which is the Demoiselle d'Avignon, is considered the first modern painting in the 20th century. So this is exactly what happens with Manuel de Falla years later. To me, the importance of Master Peter is that this piece in 1923 is the piece that introduces Spain to modernism. Is the first musical modern piece in Spain. And this is why, to me, it's so important, regardless of the quality of the work that we can discuss later. But this is why I think Masterpieces is crucial. It's the first modern piece of Spanish music.
And well, the puppet aspect kind of fascinates me because actually,
yes,
from time to time there are puppet operas being written, but this is the earliest one that I know of.
That was an aspect of the opera that was also very modern, which is a puppet show within a puppet show. So the three main characters of the chamber opera, who are the boy narrator, the owner of the theater, we'll talk about the plot later, and Don Quixote, they are the three main characters, were represented originally by puppets. And they were watching a puppet show. But our show, and I will let Kevork talk about this, is even more modern than Falla's, because we are taking out the puppets and substituting the puppets by extraordinary visuals that Kevork has created.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in a little while about those visuals. So I didn't know this until we started talking about this show, but that Manuel de Falla and Garcia Lorca were friends. The poet Garcia Lorca, they were friends. They had a very unlikely friendship because it was sort of the odd couple in a way. Not that they were a couple, but this friendship and the contrast between these two men and the similarities, that is the subject of Derek's piece, the new play called Love's Magicians.
Entwined, and then Love's Magicians
Love's
is kind of the
Magicians.
subtitle. Entwined.
So this is going to be the world premiere performance of this piece, and I want to ask you a lot of different questions about it, Derek. But what inspired you to create the piece in the first place, in an overall way?
Thanks, Gail. First of all, just to say quickly, what a real pleasure and honor it is to be not only here talking to you, but to be collaborating with PCE and with my dear colleague Ángel. We've been colleagues at Georgetown for a long time as faculty members, but also I've had some collaboration over the years with PCE, but this is the deepest and the most profound, and it feels really special to me personally, but I also think it embodies so much of what's special about PCE because of the kind of boldness of the multidisciplinary vision of putting an evening together with these different strands. So I'm really so delighted and thrilled about it. I mean, there are several strands of inspiration. I'm a theater maker. I run this lab for global performance and politics. I work globally. I'm interested in devising new work. The mission of the lab is to humanize global politics through performance. So I'm very interested, as someone who sits at Georgetown, both in the School of Foreign Service, which is the School of International Relations, and in performing arts, in the sort of global conversation about how performance and the arts matter in the world. And of course, Washington is a rich and interesting place to think about that. But I'm also lifelong devotee of Lorca's work. I discovered Lorca as a college student at Northwestern quite many years ago, and really fell in love with his, very iconic dramatic works, and some of them are very famous, Blood Wedding and House of Bernarda Alba and others, but also as a poet and as a figure. At that time, we were living through the AIDS epidemic, which hit our community very hard, our kind of community of artists. And Lorca was a figure who, in terms of his incredible sort of poetic spirit, and his love and, his work to me just embodied a kind of both fierceness and tenderness and a kind of elasticity of form that I really fell in love with. So that was the seeds, and Ángel, being my friend and colleague, knew this. And I was a more casual, as a theater maker, a more casual listener. I knew about their, I was enough of a Lorca scholar to know about Defaya, to know, the major works, to know El Amor Brujo, but it really was the occasion of this event that allowed me to kind of go deeper into sort of understanding the particulars of their friendship. And that just was very exciting to me as a sort of story for us to know. I think these are two, as you alluded to, Gail, these are two really visionary artists, arguably the most singular and indelible artists in 20th century Spain, and maybe even we could say something even grander than that. And they were on the surface complete. Falla was a devout Catholic, very austere, very ascetic in his approach to life. Lorca was a sensuous, extroverted, radically experimental in many ways. They were generationally a couple decades apart. They weren't the most likely people to come together and create a deep spiritual bond, but they did. And that bond was not only about mutual respect for each other's artistry, but was actually a deeper sense. Part of what the piece explores is their shared commitment to the Andalusian folk tradition of cante hondo, the deep song. They both felt that the spirit of real art was rooted not in a kind of bourgeois modernist kind of emerging kind of principles, but in the soul and the roots and the soil of the people. And they went and heard that music and that poetry and found this incredible inspiration in it. So I just started to, the piece is really just exploring their artistry. It is a kind of love story, I think, actually, a love story between two, as I say, I think it's always interesting that when opposites attract and find a deep connection. And I think the other thing that's important to say that drew me to this work is these are extraordinary artists whose work was, in the case of, both of them's work was tragically impacted by the rise of fascist nationalism in Spain. Lorca was murdered very much for who he was, as a 38-year-old playwright. There's an irony to me that when you go, as I did recently, to Granada, Lorca everything's named after Lorca, every cafe, the airport, but this was, someone who was gunned down for who he was. And I think this is also a story about the kind of tension between visionary artistic energy and state business and state repression. And that feels always timely, and frankly timely right now. So it's a particular historical story, but it's also, to me, a story about poetry and music and what makes it matter. And I'm learning so much. I knew some about Lorca, but I'm learning so much through just the bottomless amount of material that there is. So I'm really grateful to be exploring this, and it's going to be a very experimental, it's a kind of concert reading with music.
This is what I wanted to ask you about. Yeah. So it's not just a couple of actors on stage speaking lines. There's music and there's more to it. And I'd love for you to talk about this sort of structure and context.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we, it is a play technically, but it's really woven. It's an event that is very multidisciplinary. I think to me seems very in the bloodstream of PCE and the sort of spirit of what PCE has always done, which is, I think, bring ideas, text, music, context, visuals together. You'll meet Kevork in a moment if you've never met him before, who's a really visionary collaborator on this. So he has already done this remarkable work with Master Peter's Puppet Show, but he and I are now kind of working together to create a sort of visual vocabulary to support the text of Entwined. And we have, some beautiful physical movement work. And to me, there's something when you get to, if you read Lorca, this is work, the poetic work and what he did for the theater and what he believed in for the theater was a multi-sensuous experience. He wasn't really someone rooted. The idea of drama to him wasn't like two people in a living room having an argument. It was a much more elemental, sensuous, musical. Lorca and Falla both deeply were in love with the ancient Andalusian puppet theater, with childhood itself. Their collaborations together were for the children of Granada, who they would invite over and they would open presents and then put on this kind of crazy puppet theater. This wasn't silliness for them. This was the deepest roots of what artistic collaboration could be. So we're trying to create something that evokes that spirit, that lets people hear some beautiful Lorca poetry. But more than that, I think that tells a story about two remarkable artists, collaborating amidst what ended up being, very, very dark and violent times.
Segueing right to artists, Kevork Kevork is the unifying factor between these two halves of this evening of performances, because he's supplying the visuals for both. Now, I first saw Kevork's work about 14 or 15 years ago, where he was doing a live illustration to some chamber music, and it blew my mind. The inventiveness that he did, and the way he could fill a projected screen with what he was doing. So Kevork, you've created visuals for both Master Peter's Puppet Show and also Entwined. I'd love to know a bit of a description of what you're doing for each one and how will it work. And some aspects of each of these will be animated in real time, like you are performing on stage along with the rest of the people on stage. So I'd love for you to give a description of how that works, and then we'll see some of it.
Thank you so much, Gail, for this lovely opportunity for me to explain about behind the scene. And post-classical ensemble has been probably the easiest way to describe it. It's like a family. It's a place where wherever I bring any kind of idea I bring, it's welcome. And the environment is so welcoming for all sorts of, I think, experiments. The way Derek said, it's a kind of a platform that you could explore any ideas, and it's welcome. And at the end, the result is fascinating. We've done beautiful projects. Like the last one was just days before the pandemic, March 4th. We did a beautiful piece about Armenian culture in Cathedral, National Cathedral. So the way I approach any project is the idea of how can I bring my own heritage, my own story into this. So being Armenian, born in Syria, and like visually kind of historically kind of filled in my mind and memories, all this vocabulary, and to bring it here, to think about, let's say, Manuel de Falla, to think about Don Quixote. And it's kind of very easy for me to bring the streets of Aleppo, the idea, the songs of the Middle East from. And on top of it, when I heard about Lorca, Lorca, he loved Granada. He loved the ancient kind of stories of Spain. And Spain has that deeply rooted kind of the Islamic architecture and forms and shapes. So he was very much in love with this beautiful architecture of Granada and all this. So for me, in my work, I've kind of rebuilt all these ancient places. That's my mission and my philosophy in my work. So when I created Master Peter in 2015, I learned so much about Manuel de Falla, the way he was visionary that he created this place where you could kind of work in music at the same time visuals. But it's rarely you see in modern day, even like 100 years later. You don't see this very often, that the composer writes for visuals and music. So this was kind of a brilliant way for me to jump in and explore this. But because it says puppet, people are kind of used to the idea of puppet is three-dimensional, kind of a stereotype things that been either hung or by hand moved. But I said, my medium is flat. I draw on a piece of paper and I capture it with a camera and then combine it with animation and then project it on the screen. So this is usually kind of the approach of my work. So what I did, I said, because it has this playful approach like puppet, I said, I'm going to kind of create the figures, cut them, and attach them with hinges and create this stop motion animation, kind of imitating what the puppet should do in little theater. So you will see kind of my hand opens the curtain and
Actually,
then like a
we're
puppet.
going to see it. Actually, we're going to share the video right now. And since there's no audio on that video, you can talk over it and do some.
Yes. So all the drawings are inspired by my understanding of the Middle East, but at the same time, a concept of Europe. So very kind of in a naive way, I made very much like a cartoon-like figures to make it more kind of a Don Quixote-like. So the approach is very different than anything else I've done in my performances. It's kind of very naive and very much like a puppet. But the second part, which is about Lorca and de Falla, that is an experimental and very much like, almost like you're witnessing raw feelings and you're becoming part of those feelings. So you could see a portrait that melts. You could see a bullet that kind of gushes, blood or anything like that, but that's all drawn. So it's a very different approach. One is kind of a playful, like a kid, or the other one is kind of a experimental, very much like conceptual. Because when we're talking about Lorca and poetry, I don't think we need to say visually, from my point of view, everything, because I want to illustrate what's between the lines, what between the movements, what the expression is saying, but I want to feel what you don't see in the faces or what you don't see in the dance. So basically, my collaboration with Derek is so beautiful that I even feel like it's almost like the way de Falla and Lorca's relationship is between my relationship and Derek. That is like kind of so beautiful because he kind of gives me the world, say, you know what, this is yours and do whatever you want to do. That's such a beautiful place to be as an artist.
It's very meta. So it's your relationship is mirroring the relationship of the characters in the play, which is, yeah. So Michelle, can we see that video?
Yes, Gail, before we do that, may I explain to those who are not familiar with Master Peter Puppet Show, what is the opera about? Because I think we are talking about Don Quixote, etc. So very briefly, so the opera, Falla was inspired in one of the chapters of Don Quixote, the famous Cervantes novel, in which Don Quixote is experiencing on the street, actually in a barn, a street theater that is telling a story of a Christian princess being kidnapped by the Moors, and Don Quixote gets so into the story that ends up destroying the whole thing because there is a persecution. So the three main characters are the boy that is narrating the story, the owner of the theater, and Don Quixote. And what Kevork is creating is actually the story that Don Quixote is watching. All right. So this is the puppet show within the puppet show. The theater inside the other theater.
Yeah, let me add just a couple of more things. Thanks so much, Ángel, for explaining this. So I am the theater maker there, which is interesting. So there's like a layers in it. So I'm the theater maker. I'm creating on the spot, but at the same time, we're entering in the space, which is the theater. And at the end, we see Don Quixote comes and kind of destroys what I'm creating. So I think that's the way Ángel said, yes, we created another layer, which was not there before. I think when De Falla kind of suggested or created this piece, he was not seeing the puppeteer. He was just seeing the puppet. So here, without even overthinking about it, I became the puppeteer or theater maker.
Huh? Yeah, absolutely. So can we show this video? Perfect. There's purposely no sound on the video.
I'm going to explain. This is these are all the cut paper, and they have hinges. And I put a green screen in the back, and I move them frame by frame, and at the end put them together to create this kind of a movement, which took more than 6 months to create this thing. And on the top of it, creating every room. And then those characters are actually sitting on three-dimensional chairs, and I move them and they fall, and not always perfect. Sometimes this orange sword is actually it's this what do you call cocktail? You see that sometimes you use it to grab little bites to eat.
Yeah,
I use that as like added more kind of a joyful thing in it. So those are like actual cutout that layer them on top of each other to create a dimension. And when you hear the live music, you will see that it matches the tempo. If without music, it looks very silly, very silly. But again, I wanted to add kind of more fun in it. So for example, I used a birthday candle in this, and then the way, for example, horse gets mad at Melisandre's husband. And here is the king is punishing his son-in-law, because son-in-law is not supposed to be dancing. He's supposed to go and rescue his wife, because his wife is here captured in the tower with the Moors. And meanwhile, I added a little bit more kind of a silly moment where one of the Moors is very I don't know how to use this word here properly. Like he's not kind or nice. He comes here to kind of flirt with Melisandre, but Melisandre she's very strong, just throws him down. And not only that, throws the chair to punish him. But then the other Moors, they're kinder. They come, they say, you know what, this silly guy is there. Let me just take him away from here. So anyway, so those things are kind of added my own kind of idea of what to make it more. Here, the husband finally comes after he was beaten by the king, saying that go rescue your wife. And for example, this moment where I forgot to put see, like the helmet is there, for example, is so missing each other. They can't wait. They make love in the balcony, and meanwhile he's saying, oh, let's go home. But this moment here, that helmet, I forgot in the animation. But then I realized such a cute moment that he's going to come back to fetch it. So all of this is just part of being, playful and adding the drama of the piece.
Yeah, that's there's no substitute for seeing what we just saw with your description over it. For all of the panelists, all of the creators, I want to talk about this statement of this artistic statement that is a sentiment held by both Falla and Lorca, which is art belongs to the people. And I think this is where I get to say, Falla nunca falla. Falla never fails. I learned that from Ángel. But can you talk about what does this mean that art belongs to the people, and how did it manifest in each of these creators' works?
Well, if let me start saying that one of the extraordinary moments of this relationship between Falla and Lorca is precisely this idea of elevating or putting the popular, the vernacular, to the highest level, to the level of, all classical music. And in 1922, actually 1 year before Master Peter Puppet Show, they create a competition of flamenco, which was, considered like something even vulgar to some. And these people are saying, these are our roots. This is what makes our music extraordinary, which actually is so interesting because this phenomenon is happening all over the world. Bela Bartok is going in Hungary, rescuing songs, popular songs. Borjak arrives in the United States and is fascinated by spirituals. So this is an extraordinary moment, in my opinion. And there is so the intellectuals in this time, they are obsessed with this idea. The art belongs to the people. We need to go back to our roots.
I'll just add that, I think that's one of the things it's very moving to hear Kevork say that about our collaboration, and I agree, but not just in a kind of polite way, because it's wonderful to meet new collaborators and work, but I actually think this piece is actually very much about collaboration, like itself, like how do, art is, there's some art forms that are, I suppose a painting is mostly usually a solitary act, but music depends on, ultimately, typically on a collective, and certainly theater does. And I think Lorca and Falla shared, a profound humanism that was a sense that, like, art, one of the things is the expression of these different forms of humanity, and that to be alive in the world is to be able to kind of listen and understand across that. So it's not a direct corollary, but one way of thinking about this is in terms of like the American blues, like the blues are a form, an idiom that I think for many years was just seen as, well, that's not the, it's just out in the, it's out there and we don't regard it. We now, I think, understand that without blues, there's no rock and roll, that the blues tradition is rooted is so profoundly connected to the kind of identity and spirituality, and we sort of appreciate it. But that takes time and vision before that gets into, and I think that that Lorca and Falla's appreciation of the Cante Hondo, these voices and people and perspectives that largely were in from the impoverished, the degraded, and it wasn't about romanticizing them. It was like, they are expressing the deepest soul of the country, and they were the ones who sort of amplified that and brought it into what we now, I think, take for granted. So I think it's a very, to me, it's very inspiring as an artist, because it's a reminder. I also think there's an irony in doing this, a place like the Kennedy Center, which of course we love the Kennedy Center. I've done many projects at the Kennedy Center. It's a beautiful place, but it is a place that has its own political symbolism. Here it is in Washington. It is a kind of place where we celebrate culture writ large. And I think there's an interesting dynamism or tension between the kind of establishment culture that is embodied in a center like the Kennedy Center and in a vision of American democracy and the arts there, and the idea that the art belongs to the people, which of course the Kennedy Center, I think, is busy, with the reach and other things like welcoming people in and saying this belongs to everybody. But that's not an invitation that's always felt equally, not everybody. So I think there's that meta dimension that you mentioned, Gail, about this is to me about how collaboration happens, how audiences, some of the text that we're using in the piece is literally their ideas about artistic form, them talking about the duende, them talking about their visions for theater and what art could be, which I find very theatrical, to hear people passionate about ideas, sharing them, not as an essay, but as a kind of, as a really urgent matter.
As a conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the meta part of it is really fascinating me, because there's so many parallels between the art and this production of the two parts of the partners in art working together. So Master Peter is a play within a play. Both Faya and Lorca are looking back at the past to create new art. Then there's an incredible amount of trust between Derek and Kevork as they create this new work together, and other parallels on so many levels. So I'd just like to talk about that for a moment or two, because there's so much there that goes from the past to the present into the future. One of you three must have something to say about that.
I mean, I just want to, I guess the other thing that is fun, and it doesn't get to happen that much, I work in the theater, but like, we're just on this piece, Angel's a long time Georgetown collaborator, but the conversations we get to have, so we have, the wonderful actor David Strathairn, who's been a longtime collaborator of mine, and we just did a piece about the Polish Holocaust witness Jan Karski called "Remember This" that ran at Shakespeare Theater, and there's a film of it. So he'll be playing the role of Faya in this concert reading version. So we have an actor of that stature thinking about the role, but in conversation with this extraordinary flamenco dancer and vocalist, and then Kevork doing visuals, and all of the knowledge that Ángel brings about Faya and the texture of these songs and the music. And it's just so, that is not something, I've done a lot of theater around Washington and around the world, but those types of conversations where you're sort of like, Ángel and I sat in this room a couple days ago and listened to music, and it's music that I can appreciate and know, but I'm understanding something about the theatricality of Faya and the poetry of Faya through Ángel. And I think when he says he's learning, there are things that I bring as a kind of someone with a playwright. And I just think that's a really, that doesn't, too often we produce culture in these lanes. It's like, here's the orchestra's playing here, the play is happening over here. And I love that we're getting, I think the metaphor that Kevork is exploring in our piece about bleeding and melting and seeping is really very true to Lorca and Faya. They were very interested in the seepage of forms across to inspire one another. And I think we need that. We need to be we need new inspiration from places that we maybe have gone, oh, I don't read music, so I'll never understand that. But we can, I think.
Yeah. But I think that's, exactly. And I think in a bigger picture sort of way, this is what Angel's been doing for 25 years, of not having those lines, not having those lanes be so well defined, and blurring the line between the disciplines and the line between the genres, and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's kind of what your mission statement is, right?
It's exactly that, Gail. Exactly.
I got it right.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So Michelle, do we want now to open
Absolutely.
questions?
Now would, I think, be a great time for questions. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand. My assistant Caroline, who's behind the scenes, will call on you. You can unmute your mic, or you can type in the question in the chat and I'll just read it out. And just let me know, Caroline, if there are any questions. But I have one for Derek, actually. I've heard a little bit about Kevork's process and how he brings his heritage into his work and how he physically does that work. As a writer, writing this brand new piece, it's brand new, completely fresh. How do you approach writing? How do you approach a new project? What is your process?
you know, for a piece like this, and this is kind of, so my background is as a theater maker, and my background is actually mostly in adaptation. I came out of Northwestern in Chicago, and one of my mentors was a great director named Frank Galati, who did The Grapes of Wrath on Broadway. So what I have always been interested in is the theatrical potential of all of so many found texts out there. I'm not the kind of writer who has the skill or the gift to sit in a room and just invent characters out of whole cloth and have them talking to each other and saying wonderful things to each other. But what I feel like I am is a little more of like almost a kind of tuning fork. So what I know that I'm moved by Lorca's writing. And what interests me is like, how does what the process that for me is making it suggestive and making me want to connect elements of his biography to elements of his poetry, to scenes from his plays. If that's breaking me open and making me feel things about you know, mortality, about childhood, about longing, then I'm like, what then are the tools of the theater? And so a lot of my work, I feel like I'm the conduit. It's like listening deeply, being a little bit of a detective, finding the things, and then trying to kind of put them in a form or a shape. And so it's like I really think of it as weirdly, it's a kind of a really deep listening. Ultimately, you're like inventing, but it's inventing. I'm trying to be faithful, not, you know, doggedly faithful but to be faithful to artists like Lorca and Faya is actually to be imaginative and restless. So you're kind of in this, there's a beautiful term that there's an anthropologist named Michael Tausig who uses a term called sensuous fidelity. The idea that you're faithful, but it's still expressive. It's not like I will just do what they did. It's an acknowledging that in that faithfulness to Lorca and Faya, you have to meet them somewhere with your own imagination, your own vulnerability. And I love that about what Kevork is doing, is that he's, you know, it's like, this is who I am. I'm a whole human being in the world who's lived a life, and these artists are moving me in this way. So now I'm going to express this in their spirit. And I feel like that's my job as well. And that's true with anything that I would work on. If I'm not, I have to kind of be, you know, enough exposed to the sort of raw wound of what it feels like to, you know, like to be like, oh, I'm so moved by this that then I want to figure out how to, hopefully others maybe move differently, but that's my job, is to then hopefully that something of what moves me can then move others. And I try to be the conduit for that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you.
I'm gonna,
I want to, oh, so go ahead, Kevork. I just wanted to say, if there's anybody out there that has a question, please type it in the chat. Kevork.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because Derek was talking about being moved, I'm just going to mention how moved I was from Jan Karski's play. Derek, when he was in New York at the Shakespeare Theater, and he invited me to go see, I wasn't very familiar with his work, but when I saw the play, it was masterfully done. And I was sitting there as an audience member, without me thinking that, oh, I'm going to analyze it as an artist. No, I was so moved by everything. And I said, you know, this is a huge compliment for me to work with Derek. So I think we are here creating this beautiful tapestry together, and hopefully would be an important start for all of us. And it will hopefully tour. Hopefully we take it to Spain and share it with people locally.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's so exciting for us on behalf of PCE to have this opportunity to put this incredible group together and work on something like this that's so fresh, so new, and so exciting. I do have a question. I think we have a little bit of time. So for all of you out there who have a burning question, please let us know. But in the meantime, I have a question for Ángel. As a Spaniard, do you think you approach Faya's work when you're working or conducting Faya? Do you bring something to it different, or do you hear something different because of your roots?
Yes, thank you. This is a beautiful question, Michelle. What it has been to me most exciting about playing music, Spanish music, since I'm in the United States, is precisely this collaboration with people that have know my roots, how they see, how they experience this music, how the orchestra, an American musician, experiences this music on their own. Because I think this is what makes something universal. When something goes beyond their own roots and is being able to be performed and transformed by other personalities, it's what makes this this piece of art universal. And this is what I'm really enjoying very much, discovering Master Peter or Amor Brujo being played by American musicians. You know, I let them play and suddenly I discover new things, new aspects that, you know, because sometimes tradition is a curse. You know, you are used, oh, you know, this has been done this for ages. This is the way to do this music. This is a lie. It's terrible. Actually, what makes something really universal is when other souls experience that in a different way. And this is, to me, what makes this project also so exciting. I'm learning so much about myself through the eyes of Derek and through Kevork.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just reading down some of the questions here. Somebody wants to know a little bit more about the role of music in the production. I would say music goes throughout this production. One of the reasons we called it a double feature, which some people found very confusing, is because indeed there are two pieces to this evening. There's the performance in the play, which we're calling play, which Derek wrote, which includes actors, and then there is this opera that Defia wrote, and they're back to back. But there is not just Kevork that is tying them together, themes that are tying them together, but music is tying them together. Is there anything more about that you'd like to add, Ángel, about the role of music in the production?
Yes, I think that's something important that is happening here, is that we are also showing the process of Manuel de Falla between the music that we are using for the Derek's play and the music of Master Peter. So the music basically that we're using for Derek's play is the Falla enrooted in the tradition, in the vernacular. But something that I think is important we mention is that he transformed his inspiration, and for Master Peter, he goes back to the past as a source of inspiration, which is also extraordinary in this piece, which is this piece was premiered in the house of a princess, of the Princess of Polignac. So the modern thing in the 1920s was looking to the past, what was make things cool. So Falla revisits Cervantes, the past. One of a stroke of genius is to use a harpsichord for Master Peter. Nobody would have done that in the 20th century. I mean, in the 1920s. So this is, which is to me fascinating. The past is the cool, is modern, revisiting the past not with nostalgia, but with our tools of the 20th century, with our aesthetics. That, I think, is fascinating, the Master Peter.
That is, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, in a way, I mean, this is doesn't quite work, but in a way, the past is a character in Master Peter, because it really is an integral part of the interaction.
Sure.
There is a question, and I think this is a very good question, because we've been talking about puppets and illustrations and opera. And so can you clarify what are the actors and what are the languages? I think this is probably something good to talk about. So let's talk first about Entwined, which is the first half of the program. There will be two actors playing the poet Lorca and the composer de Falla. And those are real people on stage.
Yes.
Derek, you want to add anything to that? It's pretty much,
No,
yes.
two remarkable actors. So yeah, those are no, those are two human beings. And so the core of that piece is text-based, but that text, is layered with musical underscoring. So you're hearing, you're meeting the figure of Falla as he is living moments in his life and as he's expressing things about his art, some of which you're hearing, and same with Lorca, you're hearing the poetry. So there, I think it's in some ways it feels, I think in a way we're creating a bit of a new form. I don't mean to be overly hubristic about it, but I think there's something, part of what's exciting to me is it's not like, oh, it's like this play that I saw last week. Like, it's not a traditional play, but it is a kind of, one way of thinking about it is it's a kind of spoken libretto, because the way I'm thinking about my role as a dramatist is actually to keep it lean in the way librettists think, because I can trust Kevork and Sonia and Ishmael, who are doing the movement, and Ángel and the orchestra, to fill in a lot of the things that sort of give shape to what Lorca and Falla are saying. Whereas if all I had were two actors in a room, I would need to do other, I wouldn't have those elements.
And
so
sorry to interrupt you, Derek. I was just going to add that is all in English. You wrote it in English. That are translations of the poetry and of the writings. So that whole section will be in English. And then the puppet opera, the Falla's work, will be done in the original Spanish. Isn't that correct, Ángel?
Exactly. So
right. And we have the animation, but then we also have real operatic singers on stage.
Exactly. So we have the role of the voice soprano is being sung by a phenomenal soprano, Jennifer Zetland. The owner of the theater is a tenor voice, who is going to be Israel Lozano. And Don Quixote is a bass baritone voice, is going to be sung by Jose Satin. So we have three singers for the opera. Right.
And they'll be on stage, sort of a, what do you call that when they're sort of, they're not acting, they're singing the role.
Exactly. They are singing, they will be, it's kind of we can say maybe semi-stage. They of course somehow gesticulate, etc. But the idea is they are there in front of the orchestra as a concert version, so to say.
Exactly. So I hope that answers your question. It was a very good question, because sometimes, especially for those of us who've been working on this project for many, many months, forget to mention that important difference. But the play will be, it'll be a bilingual show, which is exciting. Well, I think we don't really have time for another question, so I think we should probably wrap it up. Gail, are there any last minute thoughts? Anyone else last minute comment you'd like to make before we close?
I don't have any specific comments, but I'm so excited about this program that I wish I could be there for it. I'm not able to get away from New York that week, but it's phenomenal and completely inventive of what you've come up with. So I'm really looking forward to not being able to see it, I guess.
Well, we'll just have to do it again. That's all there is to it. Ángel, any last minute words?
Well, go and immediately to get your ticket, because there would be, I think there are like half ticket left.
Right.
So
there are very few tickets left. So get the tickets that are available, get them tonight, and you'll see this amazing cast of characters on April 19th at the Terrace Theater at the Kennedy Center. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your time. We will see you all soon.